really depends on what they're doing at school, because if they are doing that balanced literacy thing, then, how do you know they're having difficulty with phonics if you're not systematically teaching it
Teaching it.
in the way that you do and your program does? If parents are worried and the teachers don't seem to be, it's worth finding out more about what the school are doing and then perhaps consider doing some of that systemic teaching themselves before they start the process with a psychologist.
Welcome to the All Kids Can podcast, dedicated to supporting parents on their journey to nurture happy, successful children in every facet of life, particularly their journey through their education. Whether you're navigating the complexities of a recent diagnosis or you're finding that your child is struggling to have success with their learning, this podcast is for you. As a parent, you have incredible power and influence in your child's life. And with the right knowledge and strategies, you will be empowered to guide your child towards their best life. I'm your host, Christy Howarth, accredited dyslexia therapist, special education teacher, family coach, and mum of two brilliantly neurospicy kids of my own. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Okay, welcome back to another episode of the All Kids Can podcast. I today am very, very lucky to be speaking to Leanne, who is a registered psychologist who began her career working with children and families and has loved it ever since. Families see Leanne for assessments to understand autism, ADHD, specific learning disorders, amongst other things. She has found that there are always people waiting to access support, especially in rural areas. As a result, Leanne provides online information for parents about what children need for development, how this can be adapted for kids developing differently, and practical implementation strategies. How cool is that? We are so excited to have you here today, Leanne. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here as well, because when you were reading that line about how I started working with families and have loved it ever since, it is true, but I get that same feeling from you when I talk to you, that you just really genuinely love what you do as well.
We were just talking before we started this, weren't we, about how lucky we are to have this as our job and to be able to talk to other inspiring people that are doing amazing work and, yes, serving the people that we love most, which is our kids. So
Yeah.
today, I was wondering, can you start off a little bit, tell me a little bit about your journey and how that has led you to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. It's a funny question, and I think there's two paths I could go down, and the first one is probably less palatable than the other, because I started out my career working with adults who had criminal convictions and drug addiction problems. And I really got this sense that if I had been able to come in 20, 30 years earlier for these people, my impact could have been a lot bigger. Um, but the other part of it too is that when I was in school, I wanted to be a teacher, and then somehow shifted over into psychology at the last minute. But I still see psychology as a role of teaching kids about who they are and how they work and how they can help themselves, and then teaching also parents how to do that for their kids. And I love supervising new psychologists as well. So there's a lot of teaching in what I do, and I really love that.
That's beautiful. And I love it that you saw it as a timeline, and because that is what can unfortunately sometimes unfold when we have kids that are struggling with learning or with mental health concerns and they don't get addressed. And then further on down the track, we do find that they end up on the wrong tracks and, having a negative outcome when it could have been intervened with earlier on, and maybe maybe that trajectory could have been a little bit different. When I see older children,
Mhm.
and perhaps there hasn't been much intervention previous to when I've seen them, there's a lot of layers going on in terms of protectiveness or the way that they're expressing their struggles.
Even in working with teenagers, even by that time, they've got lots of layers, and it's about peeling back the layers one by one.
Mm,
And so, an example would be, I guess, if you've got kids who have either a learning challenge at school or they have ADHD, without support, sometimes the extra layers that go on are things like mood challenges like anxiety or depression, and sometimes social challenges then as well because they feel like they don't fit in. And so you want to help with that core issue, but also you have to undo the layers one by one until you can get there. But I think from a psychology point of view, the biggest um, way the layers impact is the stories people tell about themselves. And so for kids, it might be when they first start out that it's hard. And so then they might say, oh, I'm dumb, or I can't do this. And those, if they come a core belief that kids have, are really tricky to shift,
mm,
because they believe then that even though you're there to help them, that they can't learn, or that they aren't worth giving it a try, or, they're not going to be successful anyway.
yeah. And so, how do you address that? And how do you, I know you work with parents as well. So, what sort of strategies or what kind of advice would you have if we do have parents listening that are thinking, yeah, that sounds exactly like my child?
Mm.
Where do you start?
So you can work on those layers that kids have about their beliefs, but at the same time, you can help them understand, who they are and how their brain works,
Mm,
so that they can, I don't know, it's more about self-awareness and getting to know themselves
yep,
and acceptance of that
yep,
at the same time as undoing the layers.
yep.
And so how we do it, so that means either if that's an assessment about, learning challenges or development like ADHD or autism, all of that stuff helps kids understand themselves, what's easy for them and what's hard. And then that flows on to them knowing how they can best learn and best support themselves. As a psychologist, there's these usual, these things called cognitive distortions, and it's kind of, there are a number of common unhelpful thinking styles. And then the intervention that I do with kids is to challenge all of those unhelpful thinking styles to kind of break them down bit by bit.
Wow, I never knew that there were different thinking styles.
Mm.
Can you delve into that a little bit more and give us some examples?
Yeah, so there's probably some of the words you're going to be familiar with, but they're things like catastrophizing is one of
Yes.
them. So,
Uh, Exhibit A.
okay,
We've been
and
working on that.
exhibit B.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's
Mhm.
one, with taking a
Yeah.
little thing and then blowing it up into a really big
Yes.
problem.
Yeah. Mm.
Sometimes it can be future predicting as well. So if kids can't do something, they predict they'll never be able to do it, or that
Right.
every time they learn, they won't be able to do it.
Okay.
Or if black and white thinking,
Oh,
like
yeah.
you're either smart or dumb, good
Right.
or bad. And so some of the and it's, there's some of the strategies I help kids with, or their parents with, to help, to have these conversations with their kids,
Yeah.
is sometimes a common one is to talk about whether it's fact or opinion,
Yeah.
um, or look at what the evidence there is for that thought. So if it's an I'm dumb thought, like, well, actually, are you, just because you can't do that one thing? Or,
Yeah.
and another common one is to ask kids what advice they would give a friend in that situation.
Oh, I
Because,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, we're
Yeah.
often a lot harder on ourselves than we
Ourselves.
are with a friend.
Mm.
Um, and so those ones, I think, without coming and seeing a psychologist to delve into this stuff individually, those are some types of conversations parents can have with their kids to try to unpack
Mm.
some of those, yeah,
Mm.
negative thinking patterns.
Mm. And I love it because you're really shining a light on it, aren't you? It's
Mm,
sort of like, I know that sometimes our brains can run away with us and sort of going back to the survival mode and the the amygdala that tells us, oh, we're gonna get eaten by a tiger, but it's maybe just a small spider, and really shining a light on things and being logical about it. And it's a really good way to go, isn't it? And it seems like the obvious thing too, but
Yeah.
it's sometimes not so obvious, because sometimes as parents we can go, oh, it's nothing, don't worry about it, or they'll get over it, or it's just a phase, or all of those sorts of things. But instead of those kind of comments, we can just really come in with, well, this is actually what's happening. What do you
Yeah.
think? And do
Yeah.
you work collaboratively as well with the kids and sort of come up with solutions for different things in terms of their thinking styles?
Yeah, because I think, I mean, especially as kids grow older as well, you've got to have buy-in with them. But kids know themselves and they know what kinds of strategies might work. So my style is often to present a range of options, so that then kids can try them out and pick the ones that they think are going to work better for them. So
Mm, yeah.
that's in terms of, the ways to deal with these negative thoughts, or even with emotions, to manage emotions. For some people, deep breathing is great.
Mm,
For some people, it's not. And so
mm,
you've got to kind of provide a few different strategies for them to try, and then they'll stick with one or two that really work for them. And they've also had the opportunity to go through that bit of self-discovery as well, which is a skill they can use later on. So even if they've confronted with a problem that they don't think any of the solutions we've talked about will fit, they have experience with thinking, all right, what is the
mm,
challenge here? What could I try?
mm,
I'll have a go at something and see how it goes.
yeah, problem solving and out of the
Yeah.
box thinking too.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. That's so good.
Mm.
And so, Leanne, I know that you work a lot in the diagnostic area. So when parents come to you, um, they're possibly they have a diagnosis in mind, I'm imagining, or
Mhm.
perhaps they're just seeking some assistance to find out some strategies on how to help their child.
Yep.
I know that a lot of parents come to me and they ask me about the diagnostic process, particularly for dyslexia. When parents do come to you for a diagnosis, what is the process for parents and when should they come to you?
That's such a good question, and I am interested. Yeah, it's made me think of something else I learned, or an idea I thought about the other day that you might be interested in as well. Um, but when they first come, I guess if it's for learning challenges, so it involves an initial assessment, with a psychologist, which is an initial meeting with parents and the child. Um, and it's about understanding everything that's going on and how the child's developed up until this point. And that's because we're looking for really broad answers first.
Okay.
It might be, and then we kind of narrow things down. So when kids have learning difficulties, that can happen for a range of reasons. So it could be that they've got a learning disorder. It could be ADHD, it could be autism, it could be anxiety or depression, and it could just be trauma that they're experiencing in their little world at the moment that's making them just not focus on school.
Mm,
And so we've got to consider all of those things, and it's about ruling out most things and then taking a sequential approach of what to look at.
mm,
Um, and sometimes, so if we've ruled out most, well, probably ADHD is one thing where I might think, if that's something, how we do an assessment for that is things like questionnaires that the school and parents both complete to get an idea of what a child's attention is like compared to what's typical for their age.
mhm,
Um, because if parents choose to go down the path of supporting that with medication, or even just supporting with classroom strategies, that can make a big difference in the learning.
mm,
Um, so if we've tackled that first, and then the next thing's probably language challenges as well, because if kids have language trouble, they won't be able to learn well in class. Then if, those things don't explain what's happening or all those things are going well, then we do a cognitive assessment, which is an IQ assessment to understand a child's problem solving and learning capacity. And that measures skills in a range of different areas. And assuming that's okay as well, because what might be happening is that kids have low cognitive ability. That might explain why learning's hard. But if that's not explained either, then we go on to an academic assessment, which is a standardized measure of academic skills like reading and writing and maths. And that's the path between where there's learning difficulties, progressing through, ruling out all of those things that could be contributing to then considering whether there's a learning disability. It's one of the criteria is that kids have had some intervention and it hasn't helped them catch up to their peers. And that's because there are also a group of kids who will just take a bit longer or they don't quite get it straight away, but with some extra help, it will click. And that's the
proper
bit
help
where
with proper evidence.
proper help.
Yeah, exactly. No balanced literacy.
Exactly.
And proper teaching with structured literacy. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's if I see a child and they haven't had that support, I might I'd recommend that they go and do that and then come back for a reassessment, which is a lot quicker and cheaper because I'm just doing again, okay, let's do reading, spelling and writing and see how you went. But sometimes schools will say they don't provide that until there's a diagnosis and then that's where we might make a provisional one that depends on them doing some intervention and then we'll reassess.
Okay. And I know that you said last time that we chatted that the Step into Literacy parent course that we offer is a good option for parents to use if they don't have the funds or the resources to be able to fund one-to-one therapy for 6 months and the school doesn't provide it. So it's good to know the different options as a parent of how you can get that without having to get 2 assessments done with provisional coming out first and then to get it done again.
That's right. And so that's a really good point because they can do it through school, but things like just extra teacher aid time or, literacy groups doesn't necessarily automatically meet the criteria because it depends on what they're doing. I love it when schools can, or actually I love it when kids can tell me the name of the program they do because I know they do it enough if they could tell me the name.
And the school must be proud of it too. If they're teaching kids the name of the program, it's probably a good program.
Yeah, exactly. But there are other ways, like you mentioned, it could be intervention with a speech pathologist or a teacher tutor. And much like the work you do one-on-one, but also if parents are following that system at home, then and this reminds me of the point I wanted to make before about that I thought was interesting because I recently attended a webinar by Pamela Snow. I don't know if you've heard. Yeah, you do.
Yep.
So she's a speech pathologist and psychologist, but the title of the talk was Why I Hate Balanced Literacy, which I thought,
I saw that.
Yeah.
It grabs you, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
But because you asked a question earlier about how early is too early or when should parents come to see you for help? And I asked Pamela Snow that question because I often see kids where their parents are more concerned than the teachers are.
Yes.
And I asked her and she was saying, well, it really depends on what they're doing at school, because if they are doing that balanced literacy thing, then, how do you know they're having difficulty with phonics if you're not systematically teaching it in the way that you do and your program does? Then I think if parents are worried and the teachers don't seem to be, it's worth finding out more about what the school are doing and then perhaps consider doing some of that systemic teaching themselves before they start the process with a psychologist.
Yeah, yeah. And we call that instructional casualty. So if a
Right.
child hasn't been taught efficiently and they've been taught through a balanced literacy approach, and just quickly, for those listeners that don't know, a balanced literacy approach is where we're teaching kids to memorize whole words, high frequency words, and we're teaching them to look at pictures and make guesses, and using repetitive text and that kind of thing. So it's very, very different to the evidence-based practice of teaching literacy, where we're teaching letter to sound correspondence and how to blend those sounds together to read. So that's
Mm,
the difference between the balanced literacy and the high quality evidence-based practice teaching with literacy. Um,
yeah.
and so, yeah, I love that question. And it is really, thank you for feeding back Pamela Snow's advice. That is amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because yeah, I thought of you as she was giving the answer, because we have had that kind of discussion before, but it makes sense that if you don't know that a child's actually being taught to decode, they might have decoding problems, but how do you know it's their problem and not just that
Hmm.
they're an instructional casualty, like you mentioned?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And there's many of them out there, unfortunately. But
Hmm.
I think the tide is changing. I see more schools bringing it in. People are waking up. The boat is turning very
Yeah.
slowly, because I've been doing this now for over 10 years, and
Mm.
it was starting to turn, but it's such a long process
Yeah.
to get that shift happening. But I wanted to, lastly, because I know we'll finish up just shortly, but can you please let me know more about how you support parents? Because I know in your practice and in your career, you're really helping parents, because you mentioned that parents, particularly in rural areas, and maybe
Mm.
parents that don't have the resources to access a psychologist one to one, how do you get around that? And what do you actually what do you support parents with, and how do you deliver it to them?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, because I think that's another passion I have, that I love working with kids and it's fun every day. But also, I think a lot of what I do can be provided by parents if they've got the right information.
Yes.
And
Amen.
yeah,
Feel the same. Yeah.
yeah, and psychology, and much like, you know, tutoring even is once a week,
Yeah.
or it could be more, but kids are with their families much more of the time. So even if I'm working one-on-one with a child, it's still about giving families advice about how they can support their kids at home in developing their skills and all of that kind of stuff. The other part of my work is there's lots of what we call psychoeducation as well, which is just educating parents about, or even with teenagers, educating them about psychological things. So about like the thought distortions, like we talked about before, about anxiety and ADHD, and because by understanding it and having good evidence-based information, they can often support themselves. And so, because I'm doing that routinely as part of my one-on work with people anyway, I have just shifted and taken that to provide that online for families so that they can access that information, either if it's because they're on a wait list for a big city, or I have do go rurally to some places, and I know that even out there it's just a lot harder to find um, psychologists, and I feel like that's just really unfair, and those
Mm,
kids out there are missing out because of where they live.
yes.
So want to provide the education and information so that parents feel confident that they understand their child and can meet their needs.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it, to empower parents, because the parents are with, you're with your children all the time.
Hmm.
You're dealing with it all the time, and that's why you're seeing it the most, possibly more than what the school is seeing it. So to have those tools to be able to help your child is just so integral to not only your family as a unit, but to the individual, to your child. It's amazing work, Leanne. I really,
Hmm.
really, it's inspiring.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
if people want to come and check you out, I'm going to drop your details in the show notes. But what's the
Mm.
best place to find you?
Uh, I'm on Instagram, so at Leanne Tran Psychology. I have a podcast as well, Parent Like a Psychologist. So all the listeners out there should definitely listen to the Christy Harworth episode because it's wonderful.
Absolutely.
But there's lots of clips from that on Instagram. But I have on my website, which is leannetran.com.au, there's a mini course for parents supporting your ADHD teenager. But also if that is so that's, a very specific target, because I think then it gives exactly what you need if that's the situation you find yourself in.
Yeah.
You can, but if you don't, join up to the newsletter, because it will let you know when new programs are coming out as well. And the next one is for supporting your ADHD primary school aged kid, and
Yeah,
then
great.
moving
Yeah,
through autism and learning disorders after that. So yeah,
beautiful. You're a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for your time, Leanne.
that's
I
all
really
right.
appreciate you coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. You've been listening to the All Kids Can podcast. If you like what you've heard on today's episode, I would be grateful if you could take a minute to leave a rating or a review. Thank you for helping us grow and be visible to parents who can benefit from the information in this show. Lastly, if you're not already part of the All Kids Can community, sign up at our website for your free weekly newsletter, links to new podcast episodes, and up-to-date information on our offerings. Head to allkidscan.com.au to sign up and learn more.